Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Practice Group, and it's a place for thoughtful conversations. We have conversations ranging from the latest developments to perennial topics like litigation, enforcement, and compliance assurance. We're glad you're spending some time with us today. I'm excited about our podcast episode today. We're going to be doing something a little bit different, but I hope it's valuable for all of our listeners. Mark Twain reportedly one time said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I don't know whether that's a true quote or not. It has sort of the feeling that that might be apocryphal, but I like the quote nonetheless, especially having spent some time in a former life as a history teacher. Where that's relevant to environmental law, well, Stephen Cook is here to help us with that. Stephen, one of the things that you said at our last environmental law seminar really stuck with me, and I wanted to pick your brain on it rather extensively. You said something to the effect of, and you can correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but you said, as we look forward to the way that companies and agencies deal with PFAS and PFOA, that we can actually look back to the history of the MTBE controversy and take lessons learned and apply them to what companies are going to be dealing with as they try to come to grips with PFAS at their facilities, PFAS that may have been generated or used in connection with chemicals they may have produced, and so on and so forth. And the MTBE controversy, that was more or less before my time as an attorney. I was still alive and running around and out of high school and everything when some of that stuff was being dealt with. But I definitely wasn't an attorney, and I definitely wasn't paying attention to it. So I'm excited to have you on the podcast again to sort of unpack what you were getting at there. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I think there are a lot of people out there, a lot of consultants, a lot of attorneys, a lot of people who work at agencies that are sort of similarly situated like me, that they may have heard about the MTBE controversy. They may have heard about the sprawling litigation over MTBE, but they may not know something about it. So this is going to be a little bit of a history lesson, but like all good history lessons, there are things that we're going to be able to take away and learn and apply from it. Before we jump in, Stephen, I realized that last time we had you on, we did an episode on bankruptcy and environmental law with Jason Hutt. And I'm usually so excited to get into these topics and these conversations that I just completely fail to introduce guests. And I'm much better at introducing guests that are not part of the firm than I am with the people that I spend a lot of time with throughout the week. So, Stephen, thank you for being on. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, and I think that'll be sort of a natural segue into our topic today.
Well, it's good to be back, and glad that you enjoy spending so much time with your colleagues at Bracewell.
And I'm not just, nobody's forcing me to say that. I am saying that of my own free will. Stephen, you had a really interesting background. You came back to the firm recently, but you have a lot of really great in-house experience, and you have some really interesting agency side experience. So let's start with your sort of role, and you were at Lyondell for a long time. Tell us what sort of things you did there. We talked about it on the bankruptcy episode. You were there during the Lyondell bankruptcy and helped navigate the company through that. But what were some of the other things you were involved in at the time?
Over the 20 plus years at Lyondell, I was frequently the only in-house health, safety, environmental, security, occasionally real estate, political action committee lawyer for the company. And when I joined the company, you could almost see all the plants from the office downtown Houston. We were a Harris County company. When we bought 2 plants in Matagorda, Victoria, we were excited. We were now multi-county. So really a big company. By the time I left Lyondell, we were multinational, operating on several continents, 60 manufacturing sites over 5 continents. So it was great to be part of that growth. So I was involved in all the deals and dealing with that expansion. Also a lot of the integration of bringing the organizations of different backgrounds and philosophies together. And had an interesting portfolio of chemicals. Lyondell was a large methylene propylene producer, but also had a refinery, made fuel additives, including MTBE. I worked closely with the litigation group, and particularly in focus of MTBE. At one point, I was chair of the litigation committee of a trade association called the Oxygenated Fuels Association, where those who made MTBE and such gathered together to try to deal with the issues that were coming up from that. MTBE has an interesting history. It's not an exact analogy for PFAS, but there's a lot of similarities. And so I think there are indeed some key lessons that can be learned from reflecting back on what went well during that process, what were the things we struggled with as a company and such. Upon leaving Lyondell, I went over to US EPA, part of the senior political leadership, was the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Office of Land and Emergency Management, which has all the Superfund, RCRA waste issues, as well as emergency response functions in it.
So, Stephen, it strikes me that you're very well situated to discuss PFAS, the path forward on these forever chemicals. And I think those are sort of funnily named. Sometimes I think that we've been talking about forever chemicals forever, but we have seen some recent activity. We saw them listed as CERCLA hazardous substances recently, and there's going to continue to be regulatory action. So I think this is a great conversation to have. And let's start off with, I think in this episode, and for our listeners, we're thinking we're going to be doing a 2-part series on MTBE and PFAS and lessons learned and lessons we can sort of apply forwards. I think in this episode, Stephen, let's set the table. Let's talk about MTBE for the uninitiated, for those who are sort of not, battle scarred by the experience of MTBE litigation, which I've just in talking with you, I've learned a little bit about, but I'm really excited to have you here. So talk to us about what MTBE even is.
Sure. And I actually went back into the archives of EPA. There was actually a blue ribbon panel to deal with MTBE, and you can look in the archives and find fact sheets and such. But MTBE was actually initially introduced into gasoline as a solving of another environmental problem, and that was lead. We were taking lead out of gasoline, and we needed octane enhancers. And MTBE was one of those that was added into the fuels in the late 70s at 1% to 2% quantities to improve combustion. MTBE, or methyl tertiary butyl ether, has an oxygen molecule, so helps get a more efficient combustion. So that was why it was initially put into gasoline. Then as the 1990 amendments came along.
The Clean Air Act amendments.
The Clean Air Act. Yes. There was a real push to try to look at some type of alternative fuel, some difference other than just traditional gasoline. We'd come out of the 70s of the energy crisis. I remember those days and the long gas lines and such. And so there was a push for energy security purposes to get some kind of alternative fuel. And the initial drafts of the Clean Air Act amendments that the Bush 41 administration was looking at was perhaps going down the road of methanol as an alternative pathway to get to the fuels that we needed. But the chemical and fuels industry came to EPA and said, hey, if we can reformulate gasoline to get you the same environmental benefits you would get from methanol, since these are the Clean Air Act amendments, would you be willing to support that? And so they did. And so what it resulted in, we got in the 1990 amendments, was reformulated gas or oxygenated gasolines that increased the amount of oxygen required to be put into these fuels. And while there was a number of different additives available, there was only 2 that were practically available in the market and were going to happen. And those were MTBE and ethanol. Ethanol was clearly going to be selected by the market for those parts of the Midwest that were required to use it. And basically, these were fuels required for areas that were non-attainment, either for ozone or carbon monoxide. So it was really large cities, areas that were required to use this fuel. And then the rest of the country would use MTBE because of the ease of which it was to move MTBE in gasoline. So that's, one of the things that MTBE is great about is it can just be added with all the other components of gasoline and moved in a pipeline. Ethanol presents challenges with its affinity with water and such. So it tends to get added towards the end of creating the final product.
Right. You're going to blend that later on.
Right. And so that's why MTBE was the preferred product. Most of the country, but in the Midwest, had a huge supply of ethanol readily available, low transportation costs. So it was
a field of dreams kind of stuff.
Yes. So we've got this marketplace that's got ethanol, MTBE, and off we go. And we've solved the lead problem. We are solving ozone non-attainment and carbon monoxide non-attainment. But down the road, you start seeing MTBE showing up in water systems. This is because fuel leaked from underground storage tanks. While we had the underground storage tank rules really hit in the late 80s, we were still fixing and pulling out old tanks, so the tanks were still leaking. Now, there's apocryphal stories that there was a car accident up in Maine and the car flipped and the gas tank ruptured, and that particular leak from that tank impacted drinking water wells 4 miles away. There are those who have always disputed that apocryphal story as being the beginning of the MTBE wars or controversy. But regardless of how it got there, gasoline escaped from containers. And MTBE, the nature of the chemical, it tended to move faster than the other components of the gasoline. So it would get to the water first. And the other distinct part about MTBE is it makes water taste and smell funny. The good news about MTBE is it generally occurred at levels that were below any real health effects. Mm-hmm. So the water's, nobody wants to drink the water, but if they do, it's not going to result in any real serious effects. But if you're a water supplier, you don't want to pass along dirty, smelly,
funky smelling water.
Funky water is just not good for business. And so that created a lot of concerns from that. So the other aspect of this, from my time at the government, I saw how the government, in particular EPA, how you struggle with an emerging environmental issue mm-hmm. and trying to get your arms around and trying to figure out what is the best path forward. And saw that with PFAS. There were similarities in the way EPA addressed MTBE as PFAS. And MTBE, by the late 90s, there was enough of concern from various water districts and such, the EPA set up a blue ribbon panel. And it had members on it from various state agencies, some EPA folks, some industry folks, to try to figure out, can we continue to use MTBE safer? The producers of MTBE say it's a fine product. You just need to keep the gasoline in the tanks. Fix the tanks, you solve the problem for the most part.
Basically a storage problem.
It's a storage problem.
And so that's one area, I think it'd be good as we go along to sort of compare and contrast, to use the old high school essay, MTBE and PFAS, PFOA. And it seems like it's in what you're describing, it's a storage problem. With PFAS, it is also a use problem, right? Right. And sort of like PFAS, there are beneficial uses to MTBE. Let's get lead out of the gasoline. Let's avoid the acid rain problem and all kinds of things. And with PFAS, it's such a powerful thing with firefighting foams and surfaces, and it's in everything, and keeping clothes waterproof and all kinds of stuff.
Right. I mean, it's AFFF, the aqueous film forming foam that fights the fires. It was driven by the military spec, FAA specs. It is great for putting out those fuel fires, and they still are struggling to find a replacement for it. Mm-hmm. So it does a great job. And so it served a very critical need, just like MTBE was serving a critical need in trying to solve air quality problems. Unfortunately, when it gets into the water, it creates the same issues of we now have contaminated water that we need to deal with. And so you bring in a lot of the water districts, those who provide drinking water and such, and dealing with the liabilities with that are different than your typical toxic tort mm-hmm. litigation. One of the differences, though, is PFAS is so prevalent because one, there's MTBE is a particular molecule. PFAS represents, depending on who's counting, hundreds to thousands of different molecules and have been produced in some cases intentionally. In other cases, it's a byproduct. It degrades. It comes into different situations, but it's everywhere. But it also serves very useful purposes. We like having raincoats that repel water. That's a useful thing. Mm-hmm. Stain resistance, the nonstick cookware. You're probably not old enough to remember the pre-Teflon days and the scrubbing of pans that you had to go through to clean.
I celebrate in my house. We don't really use Teflon. And this is a little diversion, but why not? I'm a big cast iron fan. Keep it seasoned, keep it clean. Don't let it touch dish soap. But anyways, that's that. I don't want to take our listeners on a massive digression through my affinity for all-clad cookware. Maybe we'll do another podcast on that.
I'd be happy to do so. I never had the patience to make sure my cast iron was always properly seasoned, although I did manage to do a church breakfast where we cooked on a big flat piece of steel.
There you go.
That turned out to be a beautiful thing to make Texas trash burritos, breakfast burritos. It was wonderful.
That sounds terrific. But instead of giving our audience hunger pangs and just a desire for great food, let's circle back. So you were talking about, before we got on our digression, the Blue Ribbon Commission. Who are the players in the Blue Ribbon Commission and what kinds of issues are they looking at?
You've got producers of the chemical, producers of gasoline. You have state agencies, water districts, regulators as well, getting together and trying to figure out, okay, how do we address this? If we eliminate MTBE from fuel and get rid of all the oxygenate requirements, then we create the problem with the air quality issues that we were trying to solve. So is there a way to deal with the water quality, or is there another way to achieve the same air quality benefits or not? But it was attempting to get all the stakeholders together and talk through the challenges and see if there were ideas. similar to how EPA approached PFAS. When I was at the agency, we held a big confab, if you will, of state regulators, NGOs, all sorts of interested parties to talk through all the different challenges of PFAS and where it was being found in the environment created, and what tools were available to the agency currently, what tools were available to industry to try to address it, to anywhere from preventing it, from not using it, to remediation, to water treatment, all those different options. As a regulatory authority, when this emerging issue comes, you're trying to get a handle on where it is and what your options are.
One of the things that is sort of interesting to me is the tension that we see, not just with the MTBE panel, but with a number of environmental issues. You're not dealing with a sort of a simplistic, this product is totally good or totally bad, right? It's always a story about trade-offs, right?
Yes.
And so what were some of the findings from this Blue Ribbon Commission? How did they get to a point of consensus when you have the fuels crowd saying, yeah, no, this is great. It's really a storage problem. We should be able to continue to use this in gasoline, use this in vehicles, and avoid attainment issues, right? And you had other groups, other interest groups taking different positions, wanting to ensure that it's sort of like a story of clean air versus clean water, right?
Yes. There was a report put out. There were some minority conclusions put in there. Ultimately, what happened is Congress changed the law. Mm-hmm. And we went from the reformulated gasoline program to renewable fuel standard. And during the course of the debate, as the liability, as you imagine, if you have leaking underground storage tanks of a fuel, and this fuel is used in all the large cities, and it's impacting the drinking water of all those large cities, you imagine what the potential liability is to somehow address all that. And the remediation of MTBE was not easy, and it was expensive for the water district. So the liabilities were in the billions upon billions of dollars, potentially.
Right. And that's not just liabilities going to, the producers of MTBE, but like we're seeing with PFAS, there are a lot of people in the chain of producers and users of PFAS that are potentially drawn into that net of liability if somebody wants to bring a legal challenge. And we started out talking about this as the MTBE controversy or the MTBE wars. So, whatever agencies may be doing to study and address a problem, there's a completely separate pathway usually. And that involves lawyers like us who are getting involved, advancing claims or defending companies against claims. And sometimes those occur, at the same time. Sometimes litigation over a product or over a use leads well in advance of agency activity. So tell us a little bit about the MTBE wars and some of the major theories and approaches that were advanced to hold producers or users of MTBE liable.
A little background on the marketplace. You had the typical oil companies who produced gasoline. Some of them also produced the MTBE. Others, like Lyondell, were independent companies and chemical companies who made MTBE. The key distinction between some of the PFAS uses and issues and MTBE is that MTBE was intentionally added. It was meant to be there. Everybody knew it was in there. They wanted it to be in there. And so you've got the producers of MTBE selling to the people who are making the gasoline, and the gasoline is going into the cars. And so you set up this dynamic of, the contract. As a lawyer, you call the contract. Well, I sold you exactly what you asked me to sell you. So it's good. Then the reverse back said, you didn't tell me that it was going to get into the water and create all these problems for me. Well, it's basic chemistry. So you go back and forth between the customer and the supplier, and under the contract terms, various indemnities, product liability theories, duty to warn, those type of traditional things. But it's interesting when you're dealing with business to business, you're probably not just selling this particular additive to this company. There's probably a whole array of products that are going back and forth as there were. And so the dynamic between the two parties to the contract, and did it spill over to other parts of the business or not? This is one of the things, if you look back at the history of Superfund, many companies were able to take Superfund fights where your waste went and you're fighting with all your customers about, and just, okay, that's just how the law got set up. We put that off to the side. It doesn't really impact the business, relationship. That's just part of being in the chemical world. You're going to have Superfund issues. And
we're going to have to make sure that we're allocating every little gallon the right way and everybody's
and we're
paying
going to have to fight
the
with our friends at times.
Yeah.
But we can still be friends and do business. And most of the time, and that worked. Here, these were pretty big companies. The other thing you have is pretty large companies. There's not a lot of mom and pops versus, now granted, the large oils were, 10x the size of Lyondell and other producers, but we weren't like a mom and pop company. So you had somewhat equal footing to try to work through those issues.
You were sophisticated companies that were familiar and able to navigate environmental regulations, stay abreast of what's going on at the agency, and follow all of those things, right? And
right.
The way that a mom and pop is probably not able to.
And then you had the folks who own the gas stations who actually sold the fuel. Back then, a number of the stations were still owned by the big oils, but nowadays they own very few of the gas stations. They are either with large companies that's their business, is just these retail outlets, and they make the money off the candy bars and the overpriced soda. Or you have a mom and pop who has the one or two stations, and that's their livelihood. That's their family business and such. And that's where the leaks are occurring. They're not coming from fire. It's really those underground storage tanks are really causing the issue. So one of your questions is, okay, where's the right place to really put the hook in for liability? Is it the producer of the MTBE?
Right.
Is it the seller of the gasoline? Is it the people who didn't maintain their tanks?
Right.
Where in the chain should the liability really sit? And you look at PFAS, and it's the same type of thing. Is it the producers? Take the firefighting foam. Is it they intentionally made the PFAS chemicals to go in the foam because of their properties? That's what makes the foam work right to put out the fire.
That's right.
It's really important on an aircraft carrier.
Right.
They really like to put those jet fuel fires out quickly. And that's the requirement. So it does its intended purpose. But in the process of making it, some of these molecules get out. Either at the manufacturing site is one of the issues. So then you got that. Then you got the people who take the PFAS and put it in their particular foam product. So they're in the chain. And then then they sell it. Then there's the people who use it. And in the case of AFFF, you have those who actually used it to put out fires, and then others that used it to train. And so if you have training grounds and such, nowadays you go to a firefighting training area, there's all sorts of catchment basins and other ways to keep the runoff, and it goes to wastewater treatment and handled. That wasn't always the case in the early days of the use of AFFF and such.
It's just a big field with a tower.
And then occasionally fires would occur where they used AFFF that weren't above catchment basins. So runoff would go into, whatever nearby water drainage, wherever the water went. I mean, water tends to run downhill in most places in the country.
That's been my experience.
And so you're trying to figure out, okay, where we've got to clean it up. Who is the right party to deal with that? And so you're looking at common law liability as well as contractual liabilities and working through all that. And those that are harmed were a lot of similarities. Is MTBE, the biggest liability was to these water districts who are providing drinking water. And what do they do with the funky water that they can't? And who's going to pay for that cleanup? And PFAS, that tends to be the first hit is actually with the drinking water. That's where when I was at EPA, we focused a lot on using the Safe Drinking Water Act as the tool to go in and provide immediate relief for a particular site that had issues. And what's interesting, a lot of this is first focused on from the Department of Defense, who did a lot of training and practicing and had some incidents where they had fires and such. So everybody's using the product as intended, and we create another environmental problem.
And so you mentioned to me that governmental entities would be involved as plaintiffs in MTBE litigation. Were those the water districts, the various sort of municipal and local governmental organizations that discovered that they had a problem? It was going to be a huge cost for them to deal with. And so they started going after probably larger targets that had deeper pockets than mom and pop shops.
Yes. They kind of
is that how it shook out?
They bypassed the gas stations unless they were owned by the big companies and went up the chain to the producers of the gasoline or MTBE. What was interesting is that the time of, if you will, litigation history that we entered, the plaintiffs' bar had just really come out of the great success of both asbestos and the big ticket was the tobacco. They had hit the jackpot with those cases. So now they have their business model and they now started applying it to MTBE. So what you had is various whether it's city attorneys, county attorneys, state attorney generals, working with plaintiffs' firms, sometimes either co-opting them as, temporary attorney generals or whatever relationship they set up, for them to actually do the legwork to put the case together and prosecute the case on behalf of the state or the water district or the county, whoever it was. And so that was an interesting aspect. You're seeing that now with PFAS, that many of the cases really are. They're being led by plaintiffs' firms on behalf of these governmental entities.
Okay, so thank you for that sort of 30,000 foot overview of what the MTBE controversy was. That's a very succinct and distilled version of what I think felt like a lot of long and sleepless nights for a lot of attorneys, a lot of business owners. And that's all pretty fascinating to me because I think of a lot of times environmental regulation as being the way that, hazardous substances or hazardous wastes are managed. And it's, you're sort of safely in the realm of the United States Code of Federal Regulations, right? And so it's always interesting to learn how occasionally a substance that will have a lot of use, widespread use throughout the state, throughout the country, how once we learn about what the trade-offs are of using those substances, what that can give rise to. And it does seem like there's a connection between something being used in that sort of widespread fashion, that makes it a little bit different from, say, a hazardous waste that you're really only likely to encounter in a refinery, and you're only concerned about managing waste within a pretty sophisticated system. When something's that is that diffuse, that used, everyone has Teflon pots and pans. Everyone used MTBE in their cars and didn't think about it if they knew about the substance at all. It is so widespread that it's interesting that it gives sort of rise to a completely different way that governments, industry, various stakeholders address the problem.
And you raise a good point that as a governmental authority, when you land on a regulation, it's a big thud and it's the law and has to be followed and there are consequences that flow. And so early on, when you make that choice, and I talk about this when I teach my law class, that when the government makes a decision, it's hard to change it and it doesn't move very fast. So the government tends to move a little slow on these emerging issues because they're not sure what the right answer is. And so in the case of MTBE was a hazardous substance under CERCLA. It never really became much of an issue in Superfund because they were very discreet. You could generally trace the pathway back to whatever the leak was or the source, cut it off, and then you just had to deal with the liability question. And Superfund wasn't going to help you get there any sooner. And there weren't a lot of abandoned gas stations that were getting tied to this, so that you didn't have the orphan share or there's nobody around to pay. The big oils were still there. Right. So you had a pocket of money to try to go after, and Superfund is not a fast resolution on anything. So it has a role and it's been very successful on some things that it does, but on speed is not one of them. And so that's for MTBE, just traditional tort law, product liability law, just seemed to handle it. And then when the law changed, one of the interesting political side note on the politics, when we switched to the renewable fuel standard, one of the questions was, would there be liability protection? Some of the draft bills, there was liability protection. If you put MTBE in gasoline, you would not be subject to product liability. You put in a useful thing and a useful product, therefore no product. That didn't let the people off the hook on the gas stations who leaked it. And in many cases, that'd still be the oil companies, but
and that's that storage problem, right?
Because that's the last causation is if the tank didn't leak, there wouldn't be a problem. When that wasn't included in the legislation, the market for MTBE disappeared almost overnight, essentially. And it went away. Everything went to ethanol. And that's where we are now. And that's a whole nother podcast with some other of our colleagues to talk about the joy.
That's right.
RFS and RINs and all those fun things. So PFAS, the government's the same thing. What is the best tool? The tools that were in place, the Safe Drinking Water Act, could deal with drinking water at a high enough level that it caused a concern. And at the time, we weren't sure the concern. The other unique aspect, if you look at environmental problems, if you look at when laws were first passed, you could see the pollution. The river was dirty.
The river was on fire. Sort of like the classic, Love Canal, right?
You couldn't see the buildings on the other side of town from the smog.
That's right.
So you couldn't help, if you focused on environmental issues, you couldn't help but make the world a better place. So your efforts could, as long as you were working on stuff, it got better. Well, now we're to the point we went to parts per million issues. MTBE was more of a part per billion. Now we're to a part per trillion with PFAS. So a very little dab goes a really long way. And that creates this whole nother host of issues. I mean, with MTBE, there wasn't much of an issue of the ability to measure it and find it and know that you had it. PFAS, just being able to accurately measure it and know what you have has been a real challenge for the agency and for the industry, for everybody. And we're now, a lot of effort has gone into coming up with replicable methods to be able to measure the various PFAS compounds and accurately so that you know what you have and know if what you're doing is actually working or not. But when you're down to a few parts per trillion, it doesn't take much contamination in the sample to screw it up.
That's right.
And the problem is at that level, you're probably not measuring PFAS in some kind of pure environment. You're measuring it in an environment that's also has other materials, other contaminants, other things you want there and such. So it's a real challenge to deal with that. And that you can have the same issue for a company. With MTBE, you bought it, you intended to put it in the gasoline. With PFAS, there are some uses where you intend to have it. There's plating operations and such, the heavy users of it. But there are other products that will have it in there. You may not know. Your supplier, you may not have had a spec. Your supplier may not have told you that somehow a small amount is in it because it just helps things flow easy. And there's a lot of things you want to be able to flow. And a little bit of PFAS really helps that. And so it's in a lot of things that people may not be aware of. And so a lot of companies got to figure out, do I even have this material in my product line? You know, some people know for sure, but there's others who won't know until they test or talk to their supplier, customer. And that is another unique aspect. You know, as an in-house lawyer, you've got to be thinking about, how do I have that conversation and how does it affect our contract?
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for wising me up on the MTBE controversy, the MTBE wars, whatever you want to call them. I think you've set the table pretty well for understanding how a product like this, or how a number of different stakeholders and governments respond to a product like this when we sort of discover that there is a long tail adverse consequence to the use of the product that's really widespread. I hope you'll tune in to our next episode when Stephen and I discuss a little bit more about the connections between MTBE and PFAS and what we can learn from the history of the MTBE controversy to apply forward as government, stakeholders, industry, and the rest of us make sense of how we're going to respond to PFAS out in the environment. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests, as well as Dorn, Emily, and Austin, and the rest of our production team who helped to make this episode possible. And of course, thank you, our listeners, and we'll talk to you soon.